Hello, U.S. history students. Welcome. So this video is a e-learning instructional video. And our idea here in this lesson is we're going to talk about the lowest points of the Great Depression. We're going to introduce to you Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and we're going to talk about the start of what's called the New Deal. There is no doubt that this is a significant chapter point in American history. I think you'll see that coming into focus in this lesson. This lesson and the next one are kind of part one and part two of this major swing in American history. And so our targets, I can imagine the depths of the Great Depression. That's where we'll start off. Then we're going to introduce Franklin Roosevelt and consider his political appeal. And then we're just going to start talking a little bit about this New Deal idea and what that represents. So let's begin. We already talked last time about the factors that led to the Great Depression. The stock market crash sets off this crisis, and then there's this banking collapse that's a huge deal. And one by one, the various legs in the American economy give way. To add insult to injury, there is a natural disaster that hits at the same time. A drought hits in the 1930s, and on the Great Plains, there had been a number of sort of farming practices that we look back at as unhealthy for the environment, for the soil in particular. And when drought hit that, then what that just causes is all the vegetation to sort of really dry up and shrivel up. That vegetation has been holding the topsoil in place. And when winds blow through, it just literally blows the topsoil away. And so your farms are wiped out across the Great Plains. If you can imagine these sort of like these black, they call them black blizzards, right? These sort of like walls of, it's not even smoke, it's just dirt that come through. And your livestock, if they're outside, they're dead, all right? They just all asphyxiate, they all suffocate in this sort of blowing dirt. And if it gets in your house, it will get everywhere. It will just leave everything caked in this. It will destroy property. It's just like blowing death across the Great Plains. And it hits this massive zone of the United States. Even in Minnesota, they talk about during those winters and summers how cool it was, how cold it got, in part because the sun was partly blocked out for huge chunks of the year due to this Dust Bowl crisis. All sorts of people are becoming refugees and abandoning the Great Plains region, many of them trying to move to places, out west. California was kind of like this great haven, or at least it was imagined as such. If you just look at this image of this black wall of dirt barreling down on a town, it's terrifying, right? It's like out of the book of Revelation or something like this. And I think you really can't blame Americans for feeling like, what on earth has happened here to our country? Or signs like this: jobless men keep going, we can't take care of our own, right? So if you can imagine outside the town of Chaska, right, they put up a sign like this, and it just says, if you're one of these refugees, if you're one of these migrants looking for work, keep walking, right? Go to Cologne or Norwood Young America or some, hole in the ground like Jordan, right? Go there, because we don't have work for our own folks. Just keep on walking. And so, for Americans to be victims of a refugee crisis is not something we Americans are used to. That seems like something that happens in other countries. In the 1930s, due to the Great Depression and Dust Bowl, it's happening right here in our own country. Images like this are made famous. If you can just take a moment and allow your heart to imagine what this mother is feeling and the posture of those children. That's a shame posture right there, and the strains being born. And this picture is not out of Syria, and it's not out of Somalia or someplace like this where we're used to a refugee crisis. This is happening in I think this one is out of Oklahoma, as it turns out. And so this depression and this Dust Bowl and everything put together, it's as I wrote in the notes, it's as big a crisis as our nation ever faced, aside from the slavery crisis. In our modern history, this is it. It's fair to sort of say, well, where is the president on this? Where's leadership on this? And look, everyone's feeling it. Everyone feels the slowdown. Wages are dropping, production's dropping. You can't find work. Natural disasters. it's fair that people kind of look to the president, and Hoover is probably just not the right person for the moment. Hoover certainly wants to coordinate charity efforts, which is good, a perfectly good, sensible response. And he says we need to get the banks lending money again. So they try to sort of give the government gives the banks some money to try to loosen up credit. And more or less the banks said, thank you, and just put it in their pockets. Just like it didn't get out to lending that out. They were just sort of like building up their own coffers again. It didn't work sufficiently. Hoover basically said, we're drawing a line in the sand. The federal government is not going to give money directly to individuals in need, because once you cross that line, it's sort of game over. It will fundamentally change the relationship between Americans and their government. It's like at the zoo. I mean, maybe this is a bad analogy. I apologize if that's the case, but I'm just going to put it on the internet and see what happens. But it's sort of like at the zoo where there's a sign that says, don't feed the bears, right? Because as soon as we start feeding the bears, then all the other bears are like, and they move in. As soon as the government starts saying, all right, we'll start giving individuals money to deal with this particular crisis, it will just sort of change everything. And Hoover just says, we're not going to do that, all right? We're going to look for these other levers and mechanisms to try to get the economy loosened up and rolling again. But frankly, I think the bigger issue, as silly as this might sound, is just Hoover's personality. He is an industrious, hardworking guy. He's also just kind of glum. That's sort of his personality. He's just sort of, he's bookish and glum, and he just isn't an inspiring figure. He's not someone who sort of helps people to feel their best or helps people to sort of feel some hope. Instead, he seems to kind of lecture and scold a little bit, and he just doesn't have that sort of touch, that politicians touch that could be really useful in a moment like that. And so, I don't know if you feel like, if you pity Herbert Hoover for the situation he's in, because he certainly did not cause the Great Depression, right? I mean, he walked in and then boom, it happened. If you pity him, if you just say, hey, bud, if you don't like it, how hot it is, get out of the kitchen. It's a hard job, and it certainly is. Herbert Hoover had it harder than most, and I think he's probably the single most hated president in American history. I mean, maybe, I guess, some folks you've had more recently where a lot of people really didn't like them. But like Herbert Hoover was really, really deeply and sincerely disliked by the American public. And as a contrast to that, I want to talk about, we hit the 1932 presidential election. Let's talk about this person, Franklin Roosevelt. First off, let's acknowledge his last name is Roosevelt. He is a distant relative of Theodore Roosevelt, something like a fifth cousin, something like this. But part of the same Roosevelt clan and the same kind of thing of they came from big time money. In this moment of the early 1930s, there are other countries, and we'll talk about them in the next unit, that were turning to dictatorships or turning to just sort of just saying democracy doesn't work. What's clear now is democracy doesn't work, capitalism doesn't work, and so it's time to turn to dictatorships. It's time to hand all the keys of power to some guy and just say, you fix it for us, or it's time to turn to socialism, or it's time to just burn it all down. There were lots and lots of folks, probably more folks like that than at any point in American history, saying, we just might have hit the end of the road. We might have hit the end of the road of liberal democracy and capitalism, and this is what it looks like, and now we need something different. And this is the environment that we meet Franklin D. Roosevelt. So Franklin Roosevelt is, he once said, my philosophies are, I'm a Christian and I'm a Democrat. And that pretty much says it all for him. He was a Democrat. I'd add maybe the third thing, and maybe more importantly than any of those two in terms of understanding him, he is an optimist. All right, he's an optimist. I put this quote here at the bottom from a man named George Will, who's a conservative commentator, and in lots of ways, not really actually a big fan of Franklin Roosevelt, but he wrote, the best of the New Deal programs was Roosevelt's smile. And that sounds, again, kind of dopey, but the more you read, the more you study, the more you just listen to folks from the time, there was something to that. There's just something to being around a person who's of good cheer. A weird little aside here. There's something about being in a building with some of the colleagues that I work with. There's something about being Mr. Beckering being my boss. I mean, you can say a lot of things about him, I suppose, but like that the fact is he like sort of brings out smiles in other people, and you don't see him in a bad mood and around school here. It's just sort of like he's joking, he's smiling, he's curious, he's interested, and it's just hard as a human being to not kind of respond, like lean into that, right? There's just something in us that responds to that, and he just has this thing in his personality where he can just sort of project hope, project optimism despite lousy circumstances. He's also, I don't want to say he's a cuddly teddy bear, guys. I mean, that's not it. He does have this natural thing of this smile that's 10 miles wide. He's also a very, very, very strategic and cunning politician. I mean, he's very good at this, and he can play hardball politics. He can cut your throat, politically speaking. And he's not perfect. You guys are going to have mixed feelings about him as we go through this. That's just typical. But on some level, at this moment, the key to understanding his overwhelming popularity is just understanding people just trusted him, and people responded to his optimism by feeling like, okay, right, maybe. And the curious thing about his optimism and his charm is that it was to some extent sort of natural. And in many ways in his life, guys, he chose it. He chose optimism. His optimism did not happen because everything was just peachy keen. Everything's just going great. That's not the case. And that's actually why, in a certain way, perhaps he was the leader for this moment in this depression, because part of his optimistic outlook, part of his sunny disposition, it was that I don't need my circumstances to be good to hold on to this. Look, I'll just tell you some background. He, again, very, very wealthy, handed all kinds of advantages in life, went to Harvard. Frankly, unlike Theodore Roosevelt, he's not brilliant. He's not a genius. On an interpersonal level, just sort of human skills, yes. On an intellectual, academic level, no. And that's a difference from him and Theodore Roosevelt. And, he wanted to be like Theodore Roosevelt. Everybody knew he was related to Theodore Roosevelt, and everyone's take on him as a young man was, dude, ain't no Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, like I wrote, if anything, he had a reputation as just being kind of a spoiled little brat in certain ways. And again, charming, ladies' man, confident, all that sort of stuff for sure. But people said when push comes to shove, he doesn't really do the homework. He doesn't really do the stuff. That was his reputation. His name, his wealth opened up some doors for him. That's fine. I don't know if it's fine, but it's pretty normal stuff, right? We get that happens. But then when he's in middle age, he's in his 40s. Forgive me, you might need to look it up. How old was he? But he wasn't a young man when this happened. He's someone who's like, he had been politically ambitious. He'd been climbing the political ladder. He'd even been on the Democratic ticket for vice president at one point when they lost to Warren Harding back in 1920. But at any rate, like he'd been a name in politics. And then he has this terrible calamity hit his life. He contracts polio, which is a terrible disease. We now have a vaccine for it now and stuff, and so we don't see it anymore, thank God. But like it's a terrible disease that killed children and paralyzed adults. And after he contracts this, he's paralyzed from the waist down. And I think in any day and age that would probably end a political career. I hate to say this, I don't relish this, but I think in our visual day and age today, I don't think a candidate bound to a wheelchair could do that well in this telegenic age. I think people would say, no, of course it's fine, but I think the visuals would just harm that candidate. By the way, the picture here is him before he contracted polio. But like in this polio, he holds on to this idea that I want to be president. I still want to be president. I'm going to do that, and I'm going to beat this. And on some level, people nod their heads and say, okay, whatever you got to hold on to work through this. His wife, Eleanor, is a key support and sort of continues to believe in his cause. But he just said, I'm just going to overcome this. I mean, he knows he can't beat polio, but if it doesn't work for me to be in a wheelchair, then I'll just teach myself how to sort of stand up, holding myself up with my arm strength. We'll like lock braces around my legs because my legs are basically noodles. We'll just lock some clamps and braces around those, and I'll learn how to hold myself up by my hands. And I'll learn how to kind of mimic the ability to walk. And I'll learn how to stand at a podium holding myself up this way. And I'll use my head. I'll bounce my head around if I can't gesticulate with my arms. And I'll use my voice even better. And I'll have my sons walk alongside me, and they'll kind of hold me up as we'll do this. And the whole time I'm doing this, in every public setting, everywhere, I will be the one cheering everybody else up. I will be the one who's sort of pushing everyone else along. And I don't want anyone to pity me. And as a matter of fact, he wants to mask. It's like everyone knows he had polio. But the word was he had polio, and he's had a wonderful recovery, and he's got 90% of his abilities back, And that wasn't true at all. The man was paralyzed. He couldn't move from the waist down. He couldn't stand up. He couldn't rise. It was only his upper body that he could control. But he's like, if I give in to that, then this goal will never happen. And so in a weird way, this guy who says, I'm not going to let polio stop me. I'm going to push through and do this. And I'm going to project optimism and confidence. And when the American public gets a hold of this, look out, because it is a electoral tsunami wave that just blasts through the American political system. All right. People wanted this. And when FDR became president, he announces a new deal for the American public. He announces, guys, the old did not work. We did reach the dead end of the old. And he says, I don't exactly know what the solution is, which is interesting and confident to just say that. He says, I don't exactly know what the solution is. And so what we're going to do is we are going to experiment. We're going to try everything. We're going to sort of pick up a whole bunch of stuff and just start throwing it against a wall and say, did that work? Kind of. Okay. Does that work? Nope, that did not work. All right, try this. Does that work? I don't know. And someone says, well, the first thing kind of contradicts the third thing. And you go, I don't know. Let's keep trying stuff. This is Franklin Roosevelt. We're just going to keep trying. He said in his inaugural speech, he says, I shall ask the Congress for one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power, broad presidential power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were, in fact, invaded by a foreign foe. I want the keys of power to experiment. I want the keys of power to try all kinds of stuff. And I want you to ask yourself, students, as I'm describing that, are you saying, good, let's go. This is what the country needed. If I'd been living there back then, I would say, tinker away, Mr. President. Let's start trying everything. Or as I'm describing this, are you saying, I have reservations. I have an antenna going up in the back of my head saying, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that broad expansion of power. I don't know if I like the idea of experimenting. Ask yourself how you're feeling about this. The public liked it at this moment. That's important to understand, but I need you to have your thoughts. Now, let's talk about what they did. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to sort of talk about the start of his presidency, which is a crazy flurry unlike anything else. And so what happened first, like as Franklin Roosevelt and his team are addressing this, are looking at just the poop show of problems that they're facing as FDR becomes president. Their analysis was that the banking crisis was the red flashing light biggest problem that they needed to address right away because of the role it plays in so many other sectors of the American economy. And so here was the plan. Here was the approach that was taken. It's called the Bank Holiday Plan, and that's coupled with something called FDIC. So when he becomes president, he announces, and this is done in cooperation with banks, because he tells banks, like, guys, in order for you to survive, we're all going to have to go along with this plan here, right? Do you want to survive? And banking companies are like, yes, we would like to survive. Okay, then FDR says, go along with this plan, all right? He becomes president. I forgot the day of the week, but let's say it's a Thursday, all right? He becomes president on Tuesday, but he announces this, like, let's say Thursday. And he says, guys, we're going to have a 4-day bank holiday. 4 days that banks across the country would typically be open. We're just going to say they're all closing down, all right? No banks will be available. Banks are being put on timeout a little bit. Or maybe not banks, like we're just telling Americans, everybody take a deep breath, right? What we need everyone to stop doing is we need all Americans to stop rushing to the banks to pull their money out. because the more we keep doing that individualistically, the more collectively we keep getting bruised and battered, and more banks close, and it's a bigger and bigger problem. And so he says, all banks are closed. No one's touching any of their money for 4 days. Now let me talk to the public. And he starts this weekly thing, these fireside chats, typically on Sunday evenings. And all the radio networks would broadcast them. There's no TV in those days. So it'd be like if any channel you turned on the TV, and there's no streaming, any streaming you turned on would just show you a picture of the president talking to you. And it's this it's not formal. It's just sort of, he's using his old down home. He's being, the Bing Crosby of politicians. He's sort of smooth and mellow and kind of up nice and close to the microphone. So it feels like you're right there in the room with him. And he just says, Americans, we got a little carried away with some of these bank runs, haven't we? And I just think it's time that we need to think about the greater good, and we're going to hold our money in the banks. And the more we hold our money in the banks, the better off it is for everybody in the whole American economy. And we're not going to get out of this if we all keep pulling our money out. And he says, but beyond that, I want to assure you Americans that your money is safe because I'm pushing Congress to pass the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, that says as long as banks play by these set of rules we set up, then every savings account in that bank is insured by the government, not by the bank, but by the government, up to $5,000. Americans, your money will be safe. Please keep it in the banks. And when you go to your banks in the next week, look to see and ask them, are you in compliance with FDIC? Because if they are, then your money is safe, I assure you. And gang, this law, say what you will, if you want to criticize the New Deal down the road, you certainly can. This law is basically unassailable because it just permanently stabilized the American banking system. Bank runs become a thing of the past once the federal government sort of steps in and says, banks, you have to do A, B, C, X, Y, Z. But if you do that, we will insure all of these accounts. And then people don't feel like, I got to get my money out. They feel like the bank might close, but the federal government will give me my money in the end. And that just causes people to stop doing these bank runs. There's more and more stuff. This flurry of legislation that happens, we call it the first 100 days, 50 new laws, and at least 15 of them are like major new laws. And this is just almost impossible to conceive of in today's terms. Like Joe Biden has signed, let's say, it depends on how you count them, but 2 maybe major new laws in his presidency. Donald Trump, that number was similar, maybe 2, again, depending on how you count them. Barack Obama was 2 or 3 in 8 years. And we've got, in a few months, signing 15 for Franklin Roosevelt, plus just dozens more smaller laws. It's just kind of incredible, the flurry of laws and legislation that's happening. Among them, there's this alphabet soup. We just have to memorize this. All students across the United States that take American history have to. So let's just talk about these. The CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps, says we should just put people to work. Let's just get them to work. Say, hey, young man, you look like you're unemployed. And he says, yes. And we go, let's have you work with this crew and you're going to plant some trees, right, at that city park or alongside that road. Or we're going to dig some trails or dig an irrigation ditch. And this job lasts 2-3 months, right? It's not like a permanent big time recovery program, but it's a little bit like you get sunburn and you put some aloe on it and it feels a little bit better. And that young man gets to work, which is good. It sickens the soul for young people to not have any work to do or nothing to do. So this will put young people to work, and that will be good. The Agricultural Adjustment Act is a law that said, well, let's try and help farmers. And right now, no one's buying the value of their commodities is way, way, way too low because we've kind of overproduced a little bit. So what if we just told farmers, here's a bunch of money. Don't plant anything this year, or leave half your fields fallow. Or in some cases, go out, if you got 100 pigs, please shoot 60 of them and do not bring them to market. We'll just pay you the money right now. And it was a subsidy. It was a bit of a sloppy subsidy to try to help farmers. A lot of people didn't like the AAA. They said, yeah, we have people in the cities who are like starving. So why are we just not making more food right now? And other people said, well, it's to help the farmers. And people said, well, the people in the cities need the food. And anyway, this law later gets ruled unconstitutional. That's one of those things where you threw it at the wall and it didn't stick. And FDR says, that's fine. We'll just keep trying stuff. And a big one for FDR, and the one we're going to finish on today, is what's called the Works Progress Administration. Now, this one was kind of FDR's baby. And this is where we're going to get a sense of him as a political genius, in a sense. This is one where they say, well, let's take the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, where we just kind of put people to work doing some smaller scale government projects, and let's just scale that up, all right? Let's just say, hey, cities across America, who wants a new city hall? Who needs a new high school? Who wants a new government center or courthouse or whatever, some big government building? Who needs a dam? Who needs another bridge? All right. The federal government's going on a spending spree, ladies and gentlemen, because we want to get people back to work. And so all these WPA, Works Progress Administration projects, just start popping up all across the country, including, you can see them right here in Minnesota, all over the place. My wife's high school had a sign outside of it that said, a Works Progress Administration project. But what FDR says is, yeah, that's good, and I want all these buildings and all these projects to put up WPA signs so everyone knows it's part of the New Deal. But the big thing I want, FDR says, is find me a blue-collar worker like this fellow, all right? At the end of a shift, I want him looking a little grubby and grimy and worse for wear. Position him, set him up right next to that WPA sign, and then hand him his paycheck and snap a picture. And that's going to go ahead and ensure me a victory in the 1936 presidential election and virtually any election after this that I want. Because for a lot of Americans who don't track constitutional principles, or like they don't get worried about the growing power of the executive branch, they just look at that and they say, FDR and the New Deal got people like me back to work, right? And that is going to win. That's going to win politically. And critics said, critics would say, hey, I walked through that WPA work site. And yeah, there were guys like this guy who were back to work. And that's good. That's commendable, I suppose. And you know what else I saw? A few dozen other guys leaning on their shovels and laughing, and not doing much work at all. Like, this job was really inefficient. They hired way too many workers for this. If a private company or a private contractor had done that, they would do it with 60% of that workforce and get the job done, and maybe get the job done faster. And FDR said, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. In fact, why don't you complain about that to the American public and see if they really care? FDR says, I think they'll care more about this picture than they'll care about your complaints about economic efficiency. And I think, so you bring that argument to the public. That sounds good. And I'll bring this argument to the public, and we'll just see what happens, right? We'll see who wins. The WPA also employed artists to sort of, to do all this stuff. Anyway, you get the picture. There is a scrapbook page, gang, and you won't finish this today because we haven't gotten all these, but for the FDIC, the CCC, the AAA, and the WPA, I want you to fill that in for your scrapbooks. There's an exit ticket that will go along with all this. Thank you so much for hanging in there with this longer video today. And you guys have a great day. See you soon.